This is the presentation on macromolecules, which is what we refer to as nature's building blocks. Now, if you recall, back when we talked about the order of everything, we fall here under organisms. You can start to continue getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and you end up with as small as particles of matter, which again we went through this whole progression in class. So I'm not going to go through it now. When you go through this, if you actually think about it backwards and you start at the particle of matter, you can see that particles of matter will lead you all the way from this level to the greatest level that we know, which is our universe. So that means that everything throughout the universe is made up of basically particles of matter. So let's go ahead and take this time to quickly review what are our characteristics of living organisms, because matter is found all around us. And so if matter is found all around us, including all of the living organisms, we have to see how it is that they behave inside of us, that they don't behave in something that is basically non-living. So, in our living organisms, everything is composed of cells. Everything has to be able to reproduce. All living things have to be able to contain DNA. We grow and develop. We talked about using and obtaining energy, which is talking about eating and drinking water and so forth. We have to respond to the dangers and the changes in our environment. Our cells cannot control the things that we do, so they have to make sure, since they are the basic unit of life, they have to make sure that they do whatever necessary possible to survive. And they go through the process known as homeostasis. They maintain a stable environment internally because they cannot really control what goes on outside of the cell. And we have to be able to evolve. Evolution is a necessity of life. The world is an ever-changing environment, and if we don't find ways to change along with it and adapt to our environment, then we cease to exist. So everything is made of molecules. Well, let's go smaller than the actual molecule, which is atoms. Now, in an atom, obviously, we have our protons and neutrons make up what we call the nucleus, and they are surrounded by energy fields that contain particles known as electrons. These are the ones obviously with the negative charge. Our protons have our positive charge, and our neutrons are neutral. Okay, so in terms of atoms, we get to atoms as being elements. In other words, you take an atom that's designed in a particular structural way, and it just continues to repeat and repeat and repeat in the same manner. That is what we refer to as an element. An element can be demonstrated in what we call that periodic table of elements that you have in the back of your journal, in the textbook, and in the back of my wall here in the room. We're going to concern ourselves now with 4 basic elements. In biology, we have our 4 basic elements of life that we refer to. Now, carbon is first because carbon is actually the most important one. Obviously, we cannot live without hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen to be able to breathe. Hydrogen and oxygen together make our water, which is necessary for life. And nitrogen is actually a huge necessity or vital part of our atmosphere as well. I also want to point out that in biology, phosphorus and sulfur are actually pretty important as well. I've mentioned this in class before, where even though biology is very important, I recognize that chemical reactions that occur within the body, throughout the body, and even around us as well, are vital for life. And so phosphorus and sulfur are 2 elements that allow that to happen. But let's talk about carbon a little bit, because carbon is very important. Carbon is actually so important that it actually gets its own part in chemistry. We refer to that as organic chemistry. So organic chemistry is the chemistry that deals with carbon, where inorganic chemistry is the study of all other types of compounds. Carbon has a particular property to it. Carbon can go ahead and bond with hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so forth, all the other basic elements of life, which is a particular property to it because they all cannot necessarily bond with all of the other elements. But carbon is the one that can bond with all the other elements. When carbon combines with hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and nitrogen, you form the necessary molecules that will eventually end up being the molecules of life. Now, because of that, living organisms are made up of molecules that are always going to consist of carbon and these other elements. So carbon atoms, are very particular because carbon has 4 valence electrons. Now, what does that mean? Why is that important? It's important simply because it allows carbon to form strong covalent bonds with the other elements. Carbon can form single bonds, double bonds, and it can even also form triple bonds. Sometimes carbon can form, if you see here in benzene, it can form what we call carbon rings. Carbon can form a carbon ring around with itself and then make single bonds with hydrogen atoms afterward, or on the outside, in other words. That pretty much gives carbon the ability to form millions of different complex structures. Now, what happens when you start repeating these complex structures, whether they have carbon or whether they don't have carbon, but the majority of them do, obviously. When these molecules start to link and link and link to each other, they form what we call a monomer, which is basically a giant molecule. You take a series of hundreds and thousands or hundreds of thousands of molecules that will basically bond together, and they are smaller little molecules that will make one large molecule. So we call that a giant molecule. It's also known as a monomer. Now, monomers will then start to link with each other, and then when they do, we call that a polymer. So, hundreds of thousands of tiny molecules will form a monomer. Monomers will start to link together to form a polymer. The process of monomers joining together to form polymers is called polymerization. Okay? Polymerization is basically that process of monomers linking and linking and linking to each other until they form one large chain, referred to as a polymer. So the smaller units of monomers join to form polymers. Again, this slide just kind of repeats what I had just said. Now, when this occurs, sometimes monomers are going to be joined to form polymers, and in doing so, we have to then remove a vital component in order for them to be able to stick together. That component being water. We're talking here about dehydration synthesis. Dehydration synthesis is going to be basically the formation of large molecules by simply removing water out. When you have a polymer, in the beginning part of the polymer, you're going to have a hydrogen and an oxygen component, and at the end part of a polymer, so that you have the property to attract to another monomer and make that polymer even grow, you need to basically have a beginning hydrogen-oxygen and an ending of hydrogen. If you have an ending of hydrogen here, what will you have in the beginning of an unlinked monomer, or another polymer for that matter, you're going to have HO, hydrogen, oxygen. And what would you get if you combine 2H and an O? You're going to get water. Okay, so that's set up that way for that purpose. So going back to this, if you've got, let me do this because my pen disappears. If you've got your short polymer here with your HO at the beginning, your hydrogen oxygen component, and your hydrogen toward the end, if you've got an unlinked monomer, when this HO combines with that H, what are you doing? You're going to have water. Water is basically going to form as a block in the middle and not allow this monomer and that monomer to link. So the water basically has to come out. When this water comes out, this monomer can now link over to this monomer, and you end up with your longer monomer. Remember, since this monomer has HO here, but when combined with this H molecule here, that's basically going to form the water and come out. You still have an H at the end, which is this one. You still always kept your HO in the beginning, which is here. So you still end up with, and I'll erase it so you see, you still end up with the same thing, except what? You have an HO component in the beginning, you have your polymer, and an H toward the end. When this unlinked monomer came and combined and removed the water, you still have the same thing, HO component in the beginning, H toward the end. You just now have a longer polymer. This process is known as dehydration synthesis. The dehydration reaction will simply make the polymer longer. Okay, so monomer to a monomer equals a polymer, which is obviously going to need to remove the water to form that polymer. Then you have the opposite. Well, if you take water out to make a polymer longer, then when you add water in, you're going to break the polymer apart. This process is known as hydrolysis, and we go through this, or the body goes through this, when we digest. So hydrolysis is the breakdown of monomers linked together, or rather a breakdown of a polymer, by simply adding water. So when you add water in between here, the link between these two monomers is going to break apart. Hydrolysis adds a water molecule simply to break the bond. Obviously in the H2O, one HO is going to link here, and one H is going to link here. So you end up with basically what you started with dehydration synthesis. Okay? All right. So now let's talk about our four major macromolecules. We'll talk about carbs and lipids now. Look for proteins and nucleic acids to be addressed in the second video. We have four major macromolecules. Our carbs, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. Our carbs are our sugars, but we're not going to refer to them as sugars in a minute. Our lipids are our fats, oils, and waxes. Proteins are our amino acids, and our nucleic acids are our DNA. Okay, so let's continue and talk now about carbs. All right, now we talked about that carbs are our sugar. That means that sugar usually gives us what? Sugar usually always gives us what we refer to as usable energy. So living things basically use carbs as their main source of energy. Plants and animals can use carbs to build structure, like how proteins do in us, but for the most part, carbs, I want you to think of them as usable energy. They provide you with a quick, usable source of energy. Carbs, remember, are primarily made of sugar. Your lipids are your fats, oils, and waxes, so they store energy. Carbs use energy, lipids store energy. Lipids, because of the fats, oils, and waxes part, they basically form membranes that make our body, for the most part, waterproof. Your nucleic acids are basically your DNA. They transmit, their number one job is to transmit hereditary information. That's your DNA and your RNA. And then you have your proteins, which are your amino acids. And proteins have three jobs that they're really responsible for. But the number one job that proteins should be related to is to build structure. And by structure, I mean protein. So, muscle is what I meant to say, muscle. So proteins basically build muscle. Now that's their number one job. In addition to that, they also help to regulate chemical reactions in the body. They speed them up or slow them down depending on what the body wants to do. And proteins are also responsible for helping our white blood cells to fight disease in the body. They also transmit what goes, cellular structures, what goes in and out of the cell as well. And those are the jobs of proteins. This chart here is very important because it has some really important terms. I told you a few minutes ago that carbohydrates are sugars. So instead of referring to them as sugars, we're going to refer to them as monosaccharides. When you remember the prefix mono means one. When you take a monosaccharide and link it with another monosaccharide, you're going to get a disaccharide. Two monosaccharides linked together. The prefix di means two. If you started linking disaccharides together, you're going to end up with polysaccharides. Okay, polysaccharides, the prefix poly meaning many. So your carbohydrates are your monosaccharides. Your lipids are your triglycerides. Triglycerides are your fats, oils, and waxes. And triglycerides are basically made of three fatty acids held together by a glycerol component. Okay? And we'll talk about fatty acids in a little bit in terms of something to know about them. Your proteins, those are your amino acids. You have your amino group, you have your carboxyl group, and you have your side chain, or known as your variant, your R group in the middle. And this is the one that changes in all these amino, and in the 20 or so amino acids that we're going to discuss. Your proteins, you refer to them as amino acids. When you start linking amino acids, you build what are called polypeptide chains. Okay, the linking of amino acids forms what are called polypeptide chains. What holds these amino acids together we refer to as peptides, or also known as peptide bonds. And then our nucleic acids, our DNA and our RNA. And you know very well that our DNA and RNA transmit our genetic material. And one component of DNA and RNA is what we refer to as a nucleotide. All right, so let's talk about carbs now. Carbs, like I said, living things use carbs. They are our main source of energy. They are sugar, so the body is going to break down these sugars and use it for immediate use, usable energy. And like I said, I want to reiterate that some plants and animals, or rather plants and some animals, use carbohydrates for structural purposes as well. Our most common monosaccharides, this one in particular, glucose, this is the one that we should concern ourselves with the most. It is the one that we like to use the most. Our body, animals, use glucose more than anything else. Fructose, for example, the sugar found in fruits. So So let's talk about real quick, and then again, obviously toward the end, deoxyribose and ribose, the sugars primarily found in DNA and RNA. All right, carbohydrates. If you analyze the word for a second, your carbo refers to carbon. Hydra refers to water. And what is water made of? Hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. So there's a ratio for carbohydrates. And the ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. For every 1 carbon, you're going to have 2 hydrogen. And for every 2 hydrogen, you have 1 oxygen. So it gives you as an example here, if I've got 6 carbon, 1 to 2, if I've got 6 carbon, I've got to have 12 hydrogen. And whatever you have of hydrogen, you're going to have half of oxygen. So if I've got 12 of hydrogen, you're going to have 6 of oxygen. Okay? So the ratio for carbohydrates is 1 to 2 to 1. There's that specific numerical relationship between them. Carbohydrates include our starches, our celluloses, our chitin, and our gums. And basically, carbohydrates are your monosaccharides, your simple sugars. Carbohydrates can many times be given extra sugar. You consume more sugar than what you're supposed to. So what is the body going to do? The body is going to store that extra sugar as what we call a complex carb. Complex carbs are also known as starch. The monomers in a starch are basically going to form polymers. So they're going to stick together and they're going to form this long structure of a polymer. We call that polymer a starch. Okay, glucose is, like I said, probably one of the most common sugars that our body uses to make a complex carb. All right, so sometimes the body is going to take a complex carb apart. Okay, like for example, a disaccharide, your ordinary table sugar known as sucrose is really a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. And sometimes your body under certain conditions will be able to take that and break it apart. Your larger monosaccharides known as your polysaccharides can be broken apart whenever necessary. So when let's say, for example, when the level of your glucose in your body starts to run low, your glycogen is going to be broken down into glucose. Glycogen, by the way, is stored in the muscle. Excuse me, and your muscles use it for energy when they need to contract and release from movement. So whenever you need to move, obviously, your blood sugar runs low, your body is going to have to compensate. All right. Plants also can sometimes make extra sugar as well. We don't really see this too much, but when a plant sometimes feels it necessary to make extra sugar, they're going to use that to build strength and rigidity. They form a polysaccharide known as cellulose. They store cellulose inside the cell walls of the cell. And like I said, it gives the plant strength and rigidity as well. That's their form. That's a plant's form of a starch. In other words, a complex carb. All right, now let's talk about lipids. Lipids are a very varied group. It's a group with a lot of variety in terms of what we can find there, their structures, the biological molecules, how they're basically made. Lipids, like I said, are your fats, oils, and waxes. They're primarily made of carbon and hydrogen atoms. So therefore, what happens? They're not soluble in water. So lipids will float and they won't mix, they won't break down in water. Lipids will store energy. Your body will store energy in the form of lipids. Lipids then turn around and do certain jobs in your body. They create membranes, they create waxes, secretions throughout the body that will make your body relatively waterproof on your skin, in your pores, in your ear, around your nasal area, and so forth. Steroids can also be made by the body itself as lipids. So steroids synthesized by the body are basically going to be made as lipids as well. Another way of thinking of steroids is basically like hormones, for example. Chemicals in the body that send messages to certain parts of the body when necessary. So let's take a look at this lipid here, for example. Now I'm going to come back to this in a second, but here you have your lipid. You have your 3 fatty acids. Okay, let me take this for a second and divide here. You have your 3 fatty acids. 1, 2, and 3. And you have your glycerol component here. Okay? Now, keep that in mind. All this basically pretty much looks the same. Let me get rid of this so you see this better. All this basically pretty much looks the same. All lipids are basically going to be formed by having that glycerol component at the end and your 3 fatty acids there. But I want you to take a second with your own PowerPoint. We did this in class. You look at the bonds here. Now, again, everybody knows the answer to where I'm going with this, but because we did it in class. But it's important to remember what we call as saturated, unsaturated, and polyunsaturated, those 3 vocabulary words. Remember that if each carbon atom in the lipid's fatty acid chain is joined together by another carbon atom by a single bond, then that lipid is going to be saturated. If there is at least one carbon-to-carbon double bond, then that fatty acid is said to be unsaturated. And if there is more than one double bond, then it is polyunsaturated. Okay? So again, single bond, saturated. A double bond, unsaturated. More than one double bond, polyunsaturated. But where I made sure to make it a point in class and kind of tricked some of the periods throughout this is remembering that this has to be carbon to carbon, okay? Not carbon to something else. All right. Now, keep that in mind. Lipids that contain unsaturated fatty acids, like for example olive oil, they're going to tend to remain at room temperature. Now I want you to notice this. Look at the number of double bonds that in these various fatty acids, that as it goes increasing, what does melting point do? Melting point actually starts to decrease. So, the thing to remember here is that as the number of double bonds goes higher or increases, the melting point will decrease, meaning that it takes less temperature or colder temperatures just to get something to melt from being a solid down into eventually a liquid. Now we're talking about fatty acids. So what's a fatty acid? Sorry, not fatty acid, lipids. We're talking about lipids as a solid. So what's a lipid as a solid? Well, this stick of butter, for example, is an example of a lipid as a solid. Whereas to this cooking oil, and this olive oil, for example, is an example of a fatty acid or lipid rather as a liquid. Now both of these are being kept right here at room temperature. And here we see again saturated and unsaturated. If you've got a saturated solid at room temperature and you've got an unsaturated liquid at room temperature, how do you go from saturated to unsaturated? You did what? It increased the bonds. It increased from a single bond to a double bond. And by increasing the bonds, okay, even though they both remain at room temperature, you went from a solid to a liquid. Meaning what? That the melting point went higher, okay, or colder rather. So even though they remain at room temperature, they can remain at room temperature when the bonds change, and they'll still melt because they're going from saturated to unsaturated. So, why are molecules known as nature's building blocks, which I had said in the beginning of the PowerPoint? Because everything around us is made of them. Okay? That concludes the first one. Look for this second PowerPoint to be in the next video, Macromolecules 2.